morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. If not, let me know in the chat box. Welcome to the webinar on avoiding greenwash here with me, Josephine, from the ICRE Europe Sustainable Economy and Procurement team, Abby from Procurement Analysis, and Nicole joining us from the London Fire Brigade. Just before we jump into the content, I just want to let you know that we're going to record this session. So in case you want to get back to it later, you can. We'll send out an email after. And please use the chat function to just perhaps introduce yourself. It would be cool to see who has joined today. And I just want to give a brief insight into the NGO GPP network for those that are joined today but maybe not a member. So the aim of the NGOs network is to make it easier to work with public procurers to enhance the uptake of green public procurement. And it's not only about making it easier, but also really to increase it through the EU by building NGO capacity to support public authorities. And this is pretty important because environmental NGOs have knowledge and deep insight and hands-on experience with many of those environmental issues that need to be addressed. So the network was established in 2016 with the support of the EU Commission, and at the moment there are 35 members, and actually the activities are taking place at the moment, and it's really Europe-wide delivery, and it ranges from workshops to surveys, seminars, crossing various topics around energy, transport, environmental protection. And this webinar is one of many framing events to support the activities of the NGOs as part of the network. All right, now my colleague Abby will take over.
Okay, thank you, Josephine. Nice to speak to you all. I think I've met most of you, but not all of you, at the meetings from the NGO network. And we're hoping a few more people will join us, both from within and outside the network. I'm going to speak for about 25-30 minutes to give an overview of some of the main issues under this topic, avoiding greenwash. This was the topic that was selected at our last meeting in Brussels. That was of interest to people in terms of, okay, we've sort of covered the basics on GPP, how you go about doing it in your tenders, but when it comes to actually enforcing green commitments and verifying green commitments, how do you do that? For me, in terms of sound, Josephine was a little bit quiet, but please, can somebody just let me know if I'm either too loud or too quiet? Just type it in the chat box, please, and I'll adjust my volume accordingly, because nobody likes to be either shouted at or straining to hear on a webinar. So please just let me know if you can't hear me properly. Great. And in terms of the agenda, I'm going to speak, as I said, for about 25 minutes, covering these first 4 items on the agenda. And then we're going to hand over to Nicole Fletcher, who's very kindly agreed to speak today. She is the head of sustainability at London Fire Brigade. And London Fire Brigade have been working for a number of years on both GPP and sustainable public procurement, including, of course, social issues. And I'm going to ask Nicole a few questions about this whole topic of avoiding greenwash, verifying green commitments, and what they've done at LFB. We'll then hand over to you, the participants, and we'll hopefully have some time for questions and comments. Feel free, if you have a question that comes up while I'm speaking or while Nicole's speaking, please just type it in the chat box. You can select who you want to send it to, just to us as the panelists or to all attendees. If you want other people to see your question, that's fine as well. And then we'll pick up on it at the end. Of course, you can also ask your question by using your voice at the end. Josephine will be able to unmute your microphone if you want to ask a question at the end. Okay, good. So I wanted to start by asking, what is this question of greenwash? What do we mean by greenwash, and why do we think it's something we need to avoid? It's a term, obviously, that gets used in sort of popular discourse. I think for environmental NGOs, you all probably have an idea of what it is. But I wanted to look at what it might mean in the context of public procurement in particular. So the type of statements that we get coming from suppliers, for example, in tenders. And these are the type of statements, I certainly have seen things along these lines. Okay, we recycle 100% of our waste. And then perhaps if you look behind that, the reality is, okay, maybe it goes into a bin that's marked recycling, or on a construction site that's in theory it's all taken away for recycling, but obviously there are questions about, okay, is that waste actually sorted? In what way is it sorted? Is it going to a waste processing facility, and what is the nature of that facility? Is it abiding by the relevant regulations? Is it subject to inspections? This is an issue that's come up recently in the UK, in terms of some councils being accused of not actually sorting their waste properly. So we might say that in that case, recycling 100% of our waste is an example of greenwash. Similarly, something about timber being responsibly sourced. Okay, it's easy to say it, but can you actually trace it to its source? This is something that's important under the EU timber regulation, which requires that timber can be traced to a legal source. And then, is there any kind of third-party certification in place regarding, what is responsible management of forests? Obviously, it's a complex question, and it varies depending on the type of forest and the location. So we would generally want to see some type of third-party certification, such as FSC or PAFC, to demonstrate that it is in fact well managed. Similarly, there are examples where we might say, okay, we've put in place hybrid delivery vehicles. That's great. Most people would welcome that. And a company might say we're reducing our emissions on that basis. Okay, but we still might want to look behind that claim and say, okay, well, how much of your total miles involved in delivery are done with hybrid vehicles? In some cases, you might have relocated your distribution warehouse in a way that means that the products that you're distributing are actually traveling a longer distance to get to that warehouse, even though the final leg is done with a hybrid vehicle. So again, in that case, we might say, all right, it's a little bit green, but it's not really as good as it might look on first glance. And then you get more complex claims, such as we only use local produce for the catering contract. And this is an issue we discussed at our last meeting, actually, because it's obviously one that's very close to a lot of people's hearts, in terms of we like to encourage local produce. We all like to go to our local farmers market and buy fresh items. Right now in the UK, it's a great time for apples, so I've been enjoying apples from my local farmers market. But when we look behind it, we find that, okay, but if that's the case year round in all climates, in some cases it's going to mean that your produce is actually more intensively produced in greenhouses. You're using a lot of energy and water. So even though your food miles might be reduced, you're not necessarily having an overall environmental benefit. So those are just some examples of what we might mean by greenwash. Okay, so I tried to look at, okay, can we sort of think about the different types of greenwash? I think the most basic type is an exaggeration, where someone, in order to try and make themselves look greener, sort of exaggerate the benefits of what they're doing. And then you have the sort of slightly more complicated example where they say, okay, we're doing something and it's good, it does have an environmental benefit, such as, for example, using hybrid vehicles, but it's actually creating a bigger environmental problem somewhere else along the supply chain. And the issue we have with public procurement is that we often have very long, complex supply chains. So in many cases, public authorities aren't even buying a product, they're buying a service, which includes multiple products, which in turn have very complicated supply chains involving, dozens sometimes of subcontractors. So while a supplier, a contractor in a tender may want to draw attention to one particular green aspect, that may in fact be a distraction or substituting other environmental impacts elsewhere along the supply chain. Finally, then we have false claims, which I think it's important to say these can be made either knowingly or unknowingly. It's not necessarily the case that someone's knowingly lying about their green credentials, but they may be relying, for example, on something that's been said to them by a subcontractor without actually being verified. So those are some types of greenwash we can imagine. Okay. So why does it matter in the public procurement context? Obviously, as environmental NGOs, I think it's probably obvious to you why it matters, but I think there's some particular reasons why we should be concerned about this in the public contracting situation. Obviously, we have the basic problem of our environmental impacts are higher, but there's also the problem that we just don't know what they are. So many organizations are trying to calculate the environmental footprint of their purchasing as part of their overall emissions reporting, for example. And it becomes very difficult to do that if you're sort of relying on these kind of half-baked claims from suppliers, and you can't really be certain about their provenance and their veracity. So it makes benchmarking more difficult in terms of emissions and other environmental impacts. And then you have the very real possibility that our money as taxpayers is being wasted. If a company is, for example, charging more for a service which has certain sustainability credentials, we want to make sure that those are real and that they are actually delivering real benefits. Otherwise, we're spending money on things that are just pointless. And connected to that, I think you have this issue of trust in the public sector decreasing. And we all know that this is a more general problem, levels of trust in the state in terms of what it's able to do, and particularly on the issues like climate change, where we need to have the state taking probably quite radical action over coming years in order to address climate change. And when you get examples of public authorities, for example, paying more for green solutions that don't really work or which are sold in a misleading way, that can really undermine public trust in the public sector and make it more difficult to get support for bigger green policies. Finally, from the competition perspective, a company which is able to rely on either a false or exaggerated green claim gains a competitive advantage potentially, and this would be seen as unfair competition, which is obviously a concern not only under the EU procurement directives, but also more generally in terms of the fact that, if we want to support green technologies and investment in sustainability, then we need to make sure that companies are actually able to benefit from this in a fair way, and that they're not losing out to people who are just peddling greenwash. Okay, so given the problems and their impacts, these are just a few examples from the press recently. Maybe not necessarily the most distinguished elements of the press are most reliable, but you can see that certainly in the UK and also elsewhere, things like the Dieselgate scandal, things like this ongoing question mark about what's happening to waste when it's recycled in some cases, where is it being shipped to and how is it being dealt with, for example, in developing countries. A lot of the UK's waste is being sent to developing countries. These do make the headlines here and in other countries as well, and there are issues that people tend to be aware of, and which kind of create a cynicism about green public procurement. Okay, so I wanted to look at some different solutions that both NGOs and public authorities working in this area can implement, and I've divided them into three sections. So this first set has to do with the pre-procurement stage, then we have the sort of in-tender evaluation stage, and then finally we have the contract management stage. And I'm just going to look at some of the specific actions that public authorities might take at each of these stages, and also how NGOs or others working on environmental issues might be able to support them with those actions. Okay, so the first step, I would say, is really knowing the market. And this might sound a bit obvious, but obviously, a lot of organizations buy a huge variety of different products and services, and they may not be lucky enough to have an expert, for example, a category manager who really knows that market. You often have, procurement staff who are covering maybe 10, 15, 20 different types of purchases, and you can't really expect them to be an expert in all those different categories of product and service. So naturally, if they don't really know the market that well, they don't necessarily have a really in-depth understanding of the product or service, it's going to be very difficult for them to have a sophisticated understanding of the environmental impacts in that sector. So, I mean, it's easy to say they should know the market better, but the question is how do you do that, and how do you build what I've referred to as environmental literacy about the impacts of products and services. And I think here we need to keep in mind that it's not always straightforward. So if you look, for example, at the technical background reports that are published with the GPP criteria, these are very lengthy documents. They sometimes run to 60, 70 pages, just looking at the impacts of one particular group of products, such as furniture or paint or varnish. We all know that environmental issues require some thinking about to ensure we're not getting sort of negative substitution effects or displacing emissions, elsewhere along the supply chain. So for that reason, these technical background reports rely on life cycle analysis to make sure that we're not actually displacing emissions or energy consumption further along the supply chain. But we can't expect a procurement officer who might be covering a large number of products to really have the time to read these, or indeed the motivation to read these lengthy technical background reports. So I think there definitely is a role for NGOs and other experts in this field to try and communicate these topics in a way that it sort of makes sense to procurers and which focuses on what they can do in tender documents and in tender evaluation. The GPP criteria are obviously, again, they're not as in depth or they're not as lengthy as the background reports, but they still require, some level of environmental literacy to read them and to understand the issues that are behind them. So I think there really is a role for NGOs to do that, to make sure you're familiar with the GPP criteria in a particular sector and then help to explain them to the public authorities. And this includes what I'm going to look at in the moment, which is verification techniques. So things like labels, things like environmental management systems, and other types of certification. And really, the time to communicate this is in advance of a tender procedure, because once a procedure is launched, it becomes fairly difficult to change the criteria, and the time limits are often quite stringent on public procurement procedures. So there's less opportunity really to influence it once the procedure is launched. So it needs to take place in the pre-procurement stage. Another function which I think is quite important in the pre-procurement stage is just sending the basic message to suppliers that, look, green issues are something that the organisation cares about. We're aware of the impacts in this particular sector, and we intend to verify and enforce any claims that are made in the course of the procedure. So in terms of how you might go about doing that, under the procurement directives, there's an allowance for what's called preliminary market consultations. So it's stated very clearly in the law that you can have preliminary market consultation. You can meet with suppliers. You can choose to meet with them one-on-one or in a group sort of open session. You can publish what's called a PIN notice in the official journal to notify the market that you're intending to have a procurement. You do need to be a little bit careful. The public authority needs to be a little bit cautious about not conferring an unfair advantage on any particular supplier. So for that reason, it's often preferred to hold a sort of open session, or at least to make it known to all suppliers that this consultation has taken place, so that it's not sort of seen as a way of getting an unfair advantage. What I've seen work well for some organizations is that when you have that open meeting, you invite along an NGO or you invite along a sustainability expert to perhaps give a brief presentation about the impacts in the particular product sector, and to discuss with suppliers and with the public authority, the types of criteria that might find their way into the tender. And at this stage, you can have quite an open discussion about that, and you can ask suppliers, what type of challenges do you have in terms of tracing your, things that are happening in your own supply chain in terms of ensuring environmental compliance. And that can include some subcontractors themselves as well being invited to these meetings. And I think if there is an intention to apply either labels or certificates in the tender, this should be introduced quite early on, because there is often a lead time in terms of applying for those type of labels. It's not something that happens overnight, because obviously the labeling organization needs to satisfy itself that the company is actually abiding by the requirements for that particular label. So I think it's a good idea to sort of do the research in advance of a pre-procurement session if possible, and then, tell suppliers, look, we're thinking of asking for this particular label. Is this something you feel you could invest in, or something that you already have? Or are there other labels or certificates that you would seek to use in order to demonstrate your green claims? Okay, so at the pre-procurement stage, obviously the public authority is working on developing its tender documents. Those are going to include specifications and award criteria, also selection criteria. And I think something that's generally seen as good practice, but which doesn't perhaps happen as often as it should, is that, once you have a draft of those specifications or award criteria, that they go to either an internal or external sustainability expert for a review, to say, actually, okay, how does this address environmental impact for this particular product service sector, and are we happy that we have a good method of verification going into the tender? Equally important, in my view, are things like the choice of the procedure and the timescales. So, you may have quite good green criteria in your tender, but do you have the ability within your procedure, for example, to go back to suppliers who haven't perhaps demonstrated that they meet them in the first instance, or it's a little bit unclear, it's a bit vague? Have you left enough time, and have you left enough flexibility in your procurement procedure in order to go back to them and actually say, look, we're not quite clear on what you mean by this. Can you clarify it? Now, there are different procedures available under the procurement directives. We've got the open procedure and restricted procedure, which are perhaps most often used. But we also have some more flexible procedures, such as the competitive procedure with negotiation, which allows you to go back to suppliers and to actually improve their offers during the tender process. And I think it's worth just considering or discussing with public authorities where you're involved in this type of activity. Does it make sense to have a more flexible procedure, which might allow us to actually improve on the environmental aspects of the offer? Equally important, in my view, are the timescales that are being applied, because with the best intention in the world, if you've only allowed 10 days for suppliers to submit their bids, which is the case for some contracts, it's really very difficult for them to think about the broader environmental impacts of their activity, to get in touch with their subcontractors to ask them what type of certificates or labels they have, or to actually inspect facilities in order to ensure that they will be able to meet green criteria. Finally, then, in terms of the type of contract, so whether it's a supplier service contract and also the length of contract or framework, these are issues which, again, are maybe not quite as obvious, but if you're buying a service contract, it may be that the service provider, if they make an investment, for example, in buying, let's say it's a cleaning service, and they invest in more sustainable cleaning products, you may actually be able to get a bigger impact from that, because they may start using them for their other customers as well. But you need to think about the way the contract is designed, and what's the potential for you as a customer, or the public authority as a customer, to influence the activities throughout the duration of that contract. Is it just a one-off purchase of products, or is it something that's going to be a longer ongoing relationship? Equally, if it's a very short contract, the supplier may have less incentive to actually invest in any type of green activities. And sometimes putting in place a framework agreement which covers multiple contracts can really help motivate suppliers to make those investments, because they know that it's not just the one contract, but there are potentially future contracts. And in some cases, they may not the initial contracts may not have all the sustainability measures in place that the public authority might like, but there can be a requirement under the framework agreement for the supplier to consistently improve its green performance under the contract. Okay, moving on to the tender evaluation stage. So generally you have what's called an evaluation panel who are going to be scoring the tenders. And in some cases, if it's a contract, for example, a construction contract, you might expect to have a sustainability expert on that panel itself, so that they're able to read the different parts of the tenders that address environmental issues, and to have an influence on the scoring under those criteria. Or in some cases, it may be that this sustainability expert isn't necessarily on the panel, but they're asked to provide an opinion on particular points. I think this is something that Nicole has probably done it in her capacity, so she might mention that later on. And in the process of tender evaluation, I think it's really important to note that it's always possible, unless it's been ruled out in the tender documents, to ask bidders to clarify their tenders, and that can include explaining any specific green claims that they've made. I think there's sometimes a fear of doing this amongst public authorities, and it is an issue on which the procurement directives are fairly clear that you can request clarification. That doesn't mean that they can submit a totally new bid, or that they can add something in that they hadn't even mentioned in their original tender, for example. But if they make a green claim, for example, we recycle 100% of our waste, it's perfectly open to the public authority to go back to them and say, okay, well, what do you actually mean by that? What's the facility? What type of inspection regime is in place? How is waste being sorted, etc., etc. I remember actually when I was working with London Fire Brigade that we had the chance to visit a waste sorting facility, which was really quite interesting. So I think there's scope for those type of activities within public sector contracts. If the supplier isn't able to support their claim, or if there's evidence of misleading information, that is actually a grounds for rejecting a tender under the directive. So it is a grounds for actually saying, look, you've put in what we consider to be misleading information, therefore we cannot accept your bid, or you haven't been able to support your claim. Now, that won't always be the best solution. In some cases, if it's a lack of supporting information, you might just say, okay, well, they're not going to score really at all under that particular criterion. But in some cases, for more serious environmental problems, you would actually reject the tender overall. Likewise, if a bidder has been convicted of any environmental crimes, for example, of illegal dumping, for example, then there is a possibility under the procurement directives to eliminate them from the competition. Within the tender evaluation process, I mentioned, that you can carry out site visits. You can also request samples of products, and these can be tested. For example, if you're buying vehicles, you might want to test the emissions yourself, given what we know about emissions claims being exaggerated by vehicle manufacturers. So all of these are possible during the tender evaluation stage. Labels I've mentioned already, and these are obviously quite an important part of GPP. We've discussed them already at previous meetings, but just to recap, you can request a particular label, you can mention a particular label in the tender documents. You do have to include these magic words or equivalents. And what does that mean? What it means is that if a supplier offers an alternative label, then they would be required to submit evidence of its equivalence. And what that would mean is that they would need to show that it addresses the same or very similar criteria to the particular label that the public authority has asked for. And this is something that's new under the 2014 directives. Previously, a supplier could always say, well, we don't have a label, but here's a technical information sheet, effectively a self-declaration, and that means that our products meet these criteria. Under the new directives, what's changed is that you can insist on them having some form of third-party certification unless there's some exceptional reason why they weren't able to obtain that. So, for example, the label isn't available in their particular region, or they applied for it, but it wasn't provided, they applied in good time, but it wasn't provided in time for the tender, in which case you would probably write into your terms of contract that label would be obtained within the first few months of the contract or whatever a reasonable time limit is. So there is this ability to rely on labels. And really the importance of this is that it takes some of the work out of verifying label, environmental claims, accepting that procurers can't be experts on the environmental impacts in all product sectors. There are reputable labels out there, that can be used to verify claims. Okay, just some examples of how you can and can't refer to eco-labels in tenders. As I mentioned, you can't insist on one particular label. You do have to accept equivalence. And the second point there, bidders will be awarded additional marks if they have the EU eco-label or equivalent for all of their products. The problem with that is that there's this general link to the subject matter requirement in public procurement. So we need to make sure that we're evaluating the specific goods or services that we're buying, not the overall practices of the bidding company. And similarly, you could sort of just say, right, we're going to reject you no matter what if you don't have an eco label. You do need to allow that in some cases, exceptional cases, a supplier could provide in the first instance the self-declaration and then later on produce the eco label. Okay. Moving on to the final stage, which is the contract management stage, obviously the most important, but in some cases it doesn't really get the attention I think it needs because we get quite focused on what happens at the evaluation stage. So in terms of contract delivery, it is important to note that you can pass on obligations to subcontractors, although the main contractor will normally retain overall liability and responsibility for the contract. There are new provisions on subcontractors which essentially require transparency in the supply chain and allow public authorities to ask for supply chain management systems. And as I mentioned already, if there's evidence that either contractor or subcontractor is in violation of EU or national or indeed international laws on the environment, then they can either be required to replace it if it's a subcontractor or indeed their tender can be rejected. In terms of monitoring, generally you would see GPP as being a standing item on the agenda for contract review meetings. Environmental management systems such as ISO 14000 or EMAS may also be important at the contract delivery stage. And the terms of the contract should really reflect the possibility of either penalties or incentives or even both linked to environmental performance. But overall, I think it's quite important to maintain a sort of open dialogue with contractors. Sometimes it gets into a more adversarial environment, but I think generally performance is generally better when there's sort of an ongoing open dialogue about green issues within a contract. The role for NGOs might include communicating successes and also sort of ensuring that lessons are learned, for example, for other public authorities to learn from the experience of one who's already implementing GPP. Okay, I want to hand the microphone over to Nicole. And are you there, Nicole? Type something in the box. So thanks for joining us, Nicole. So I was hoping you could just, in the first instance, talk briefly about the type of procurement that LSB engages in.
Can you hear me again?
Yes, we can hear you now. I think.
I'm so sorry what's going on with our IT today. It's not working well. I think I was explaining the undertake that is similar to most local authorities, but also has very fire-specific types of areas. And I think probably because we're short on time, it's really helpful I jump on to some of the other questions that I know you about. It's along a bit more. It's been about 15 years that I've been working on this area, and it's very much sort of incremental as well as some big steps along the way. So we'd have a number of sorts of things, including both through requirements, but also through working with them during the contract where it hasn't been specific. We've been carbon targets for contracts, waste collection contracts with waste targets, recycling targets, and also for major build projects. And so interesting that has come out by requiring minimum CO2 ratings on any vehicles proposed, as well as things major building program requiring they achieve research established assessment methodology. So there's a whole different areas that we've covered across different types of procurement.
Okay, thanks for that, Nicole. So you just to recap, so you said it's about 15.
Continue on to your questions.
Yeah.
In terms of the sorts of change. I think the delay on I know we were going to talk next about the challenges that are faced in verifying green claims by bidders, and it was interesting to see a number of the points that you raised in your presentation. I think very much ring true for us. We've had times where we've had suppliers talk about providing environmentally with absolutely no indication of what's the basis for that, whether that be because it's recycled content or it can meet a particular standard, or a eco label or anything like. But what I have found is that the sort of things that were mentioned, so clarification of the suppliers' statements, requesting information, and really do make quite a difference. There's also looking at some of the other areas we look at where we want to actually enter the contract, where we actually, like if we'd require FSC cases that define that the timber that has actually been procured is FSC certified. So there's lots of things we can ask for as continuing verification during the contract as well as at the tendering stage.
Okay, thanks for that, Nicole. Apologies that we were still having a little bit of difficulty hearing, but just to recap, Nicole mentioned that LFB have been working on this for about 15 years. She mentioned some specific areas such as fleet management and the building works contract where they've put a lot of effort into GPP. She mentioned as well that suppliers often put forward claims without any evidence, and that's something they've had to deal with over the course of sort of improving their GPP. Nicole, I'm not sure if you can still hear us, but I was wondering if you had any specific sort of advice for organisations who are just starting out on GPP or who are maybe not quite as far along the path? What you know, are there any specific tips you might give them in terms of what's worked well at LSE?
Yeah, so the things that work well for us is very much around starting with the simple things. I mean, what you really want to do is you want to get buy-in from the rest of your organisations, from the procurement staff through to the clients that actually are the ones that want you to buy whatever it is you're procuring, so that they can see that this is manageable and it's possible and they can see the benefits. And sometimes those easy wins can be the areas that you don't perhaps spend an awful lot on, such as be highly visible to your staff as well, which can really also help to get their buy-in. So I think that's a good starting place. And the things that aren't business critical, so people aren't going to be quite as nervous about what happens meets, you know, what happens, you can't put the fire out with this bit of equipment, that kind of approach. I think the other thing is that there are so many standards and criteria make use of, that it really does make life a lot easier if you work with those, because that's what lots of other people are asking for, and it's what the suppliers are actually going to be readily working towards delivering. If it's a product, the GPP criteria are great, as are eco labels to be able to use. If it's a service that they provide that has lots of potential impacts, such as pollution contract, for instance, they have to wash the kit after they've been to a fire, so there's lots of potential pollution there, lots of energy usage. So an environmental management system is a really great thing, and contract as a standard to require, and also things like fleet maintenance, that works quite well. And I think the other thing is that I would say is that it's very important that including things in a contract, that you really focus on what are big things that are high impact for that contract to include, because I think experience is saying try and include everything that you think is relevant, even if some things are only marginally relevant. What will happen is you're giving your whole wish list suppliers, and they won't any of that particularly well, whereas if you give them just the top sort of key things that are the most relevant, then they can focus in on that, and then they can deliver a lot more.
Okay, that's interesting, and I think that's good advice for other organisations to take forward. Thanks for that, Nicole. Apologies that it was a little bit hard to hear, but I think you picked up on some interesting points, particularly in terms of the value to suppliers of investing in some of these, for example, eco labels or other, environmental certifications, which can actually then be of value to them in terms of other customers. So that's great to hear LSB's experience, and I understand that I think you have another meeting to go to. So I think we're probably drawing to the close of the webinar. If anybody wants to put in a question in the last few minutes, please feel free. You can put up your hand just using the participant box. There's a little icon. It doesn't really look like a hand to me. It looks more like actually a fire, appropriately enough. But you can either do that if you want to ask a question in person, or you can also type something in the chat box. Obviously, for those of you who are in the NGO network, you'll be familiar with the website of the network, and this presentation and the recording, I believe, of the webinar as well will be going up on that website. Is that right, Josephine?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're going to upload the recording today or tomorrow.
Great. Okay, so everyone will be able to access it there. If there aren't any questions, I'm just looking in the chat box here. I don't see any specific questions. Let me just check the other box. Sorry, I see one from Sylvia saying, could you please speak louder? But I think that's a little bit, that was from the beginning of the webinar. Okay, so thank you very much to everyone who attended, and I look forward to seeing some or all of you at the next NGO Network meeting, wherever that may be. And I wish you a very good morning or afternoon. Okay, goodbye.